We will reconvene the 67th public meeting of the Mass Gaming Commission on the 16th of May. And we will start out with Dr. Rachel Goldberg, who is the principal investigator on the research project that everybody has heard so much about, and the head of our team that's headquartered at UMass Amherst that is doing the research project. Thanks for coming down. We actually, two of us saw a good portion of this. Enrique, Commissioner Zuniga and I saw a good portion of this and thought that it was so interesting that everybody else would like to see it too. You might start out by just giving us a quick status report on where the project is, and then take over.
Okay, a quick status report is that we are underway. We have, I believe there is a interagency services agreement that is being negotiated between the university and the commission. We actually had already started working on the project when we were notified in April. So the work on the social and economic indicators, the secondary data streams that we're going to be identifying and then monitoring over time are in the process of being identified. The main focus of our activity right now is on the baseline population survey, because time really is of the essence if we are going to get into the field and then out of the field again by the time the first licenses are announced. And we want to do that in order to get a clean snapshot of the population before anybody knows where the casinos or the slot parlor are going to be. We actually are very close to having a final questionnaire. We still have some work to do on our sampling strategy, and the NORC team is working very hard to put together a packet of materials for their internal ethics review board. They have their ethics review, and then we are going to.
This is for survey ethics.
This is for survey research. Anytime you have anything to do with doing research with human beings, you have to go through an ethics review, and so to ensure that the benefits outweigh the risks of whatever you're doing. And so NORC has its own internal ethics review board, which they will do a review of all of the materials that any of the respondents would sort of be presented with have to be reviewed by the board. Once the NORC's IRB has approved the project to go forward, then their certificate is going to be included in our UMass ethics review protocol to get UMass approval as well. So we are moving forward as quickly as we possibly can.
Great. Do you get some graduate students, or you got some help?
Yes, I have a young undergraduate in the School of Public Health who's helping me with scheduling, and we actually are getting quite a bit of help from a large number of the School of Public Health graduate students. Both the master's level and the doctoral level students have been helping on the social impact side.
Right.
And then the Donahue Institute people have been working hard as well.
Right. Great.
So.
Good. Very
yeah.
exciting.
Yes, very exciting. Very exciting indeed. So when you and Commissioner Zuniga came out, we actually spent an hour and a half just presenting the material that I'm going to try to fly through as expeditiously as possible, so that you can have some time for questions and discussion. So I think maybe if we sort of wait to have questions at the end, or
Yeah, unless something really pops up.
unless something goes, I can't read that, or okay, and I'm going to put my glasses on to make sure that I get all of my key points read. Let's see. So, all right, so just to begin with, The social and economic analysis of gambling impacts is a major issue and has major policy implications, but historically the field has been beset with methodological and theoretical problems. There's been a great deal of disagreement about what should be measured, about how it should be measured, about what counts as an impact. And so in, I believe it was 2009, the Canadian Consortium for Gambling Research, which is a group of provincial representatives of provincial governments that fund gambling research, realized that a new theoretical framework was needed to have an impact on the field, and that to have and to be effective as a framework, that it needed to be extremely well thought out, and it needed to exhaustively include all of the literature on the topic. The cover of the report here, I know some of you are familiar with it. This is the first thing that I came to the commission with, actually, when I first met with Commissioners Stebbins and Zuniga. And I said, okay, there's this report that's done, a review of all of the literature, and they found 7 studies that were excellent and 22 or 24 that were good, and the rest of the 492 were pretty much garbage.
It's a staggering.
So
27
out of 492. It's a pretty sad commentary, but it's extremely indicative of sort of the state of thinking in this area. So the final report, this is the cover of it, they summarized all of the findings of all of the empirical studies, and they proposed a framework that made theoretical sense, enshrined both economic principles and social impact considerations, and it was simple and straightforward to use. So all of those things are really important if you're going to get people to use it. And Rob mentioned in our kickoff meeting that the final report has had the desired impact. It's been very well accepted by both the research community and by governments, and in fact, it's been downloaded thousands of times since it was first posted in 2011.
And Rob Williams, who's the lead writer of this, is the co-PI on our project.
Right, and Rob and I have a very long history of working together. We've worked continuously on a series of projects to improve methods in survey research in gambling studies since 2007. So when I saw the statute, I was like, oh, I think we need Rob, and he was very excited to come along. So very briefly, the principles that are enshrined in this theoretical approach or this theoretical framework are that many impacts of gambling introduction or gambling expansion are not clearly positive or negative. It's important to cast an extremely wide net when you're looking at impacts. And while identifying the cost of problem gambling treatment is fine, it's important to not apply a monetized value to things like the psychic trauma of being a problem gambler, or suicides, or the leisure benefit of gambling. It's important simply to report the percentage change in the variable or the actual number of people impacted. So rather than try and turn everything into dollar signs, it's important to simply recognize those impacts and make sure that they're included in your framework. So, this isn't going to be a surprise to anyone, I hope, that there are very strong vested interests that affect the research on gambling impacts. And a lot of the reason that out of those 492 studies, only 7 were excellent was that so many of them, especially early on, were funded by the industry. So, to sort of say, okay, we did a great thing, or, yes, we met our promises. So industry commission studies tend to describe the positive economic benefits, and few costs, if any, are acknowledged or admitted. Government-sponsored research has a greater potential for independence, But these studies also often have a vested interest in a positive outcome, either because of the increased tax revenues or because, as in Canada, the gambling is the government. Not many people sort of realize that, but in many other jurisdictions, the gambling, all of the legal gambling is operated by the government.
Like our lottery.
Like our lottery, yes. But in Canada, it's all forms of gambling. There's also, the strong vested interest of the research team that can consciously or unconsciously collude in this kind of research because they want future contracts from the funders. So it's not like anyone is, free and clear here, that everybody has very strong stakes in how they want the research to turn out. And I think from the point of view of ensuring that the research is the best it can be, you have to understand those interests and account for them and try to ensure that they don't affect the results of the study. So, our sort of takeaway message from this is that socioeconomic research funding needs to come from independent agencies who don't have a vested interest in the outcome of the study. And I certainly think that's what we have here. So the next issue is sort of, what do we think we should measure? I said earlier that a wide net needed to be cast to capture and report all of the economic, but also all of the social variables that may be impacted. Typically, social and economic impact studies have only measured and reported on the most apparent economic impacts, the ones that are easily turned into dollar signs. There's a few examples here. You can probably find out more about each of those individual studies by looking in the theoretical framework report, because one of the reasons that report is so long is because they summarized each of those studies at the back of the volume. Now, this is from the original report. This is the economic indices. You can see that most of them are things that can be valued, but it's important to remember or to realize that some of them are things that can't necessarily be valued. So not everything on the economic side can have dollar signs put to it either. The social indices or indicators are the ones that are much harder to put dollar values on. And I wanted to add that the commission in the RFR that you issued actually added categories to this list that you wanted us to cover in the study here in Massachusetts. For example, on the social side, you wanted us to look at employment, housing, education, environmental issues, and on the economic side, the issue of tourism was added. So we are looking at that full array of indicators that are in the RFR. Now, when it comes to how to measure the impacts, the traditional approach, as I've said a couple of times already, is to use money as a way to quantify all of the impacts. And while it's appropriate for most economic changes, it's rather inappropriate and often inadequate for capturing many of the social impacts. And some of the sort of obvious things are how do you measure a suicide? Is it the cost of burying the person? Is it what dollars can you put to that? But really. My sort of personal experience in this, or not personal, but I've sat in quite a number of hearings where problem gamblers have come to testify in front of a legislative committee. And one of the saddest stories I ever heard was a guy in Washington who came up and he said, I love my wife, we had a wonderful marriage, we brought up these wonderful kids. He says, but she became a problem gambler and now I have to divorce her. I don't want to divorce her, but I have to divorce her because otherwise I'm liable for all of her debts. And it was really you know, an eye-opener, I think, for a lot of the legislators, but from my perspective as a researcher, it really points to how difficult it is to sort of value or, you know, monetize, you know, personal impacts like that. So, and the point that Rob made in our kickoff meeting is that this is not an issue that's restricted to gambling, that there actually is widespread dissatisfaction with cost-benefit analysis approaches. I forget the one that you liked especially, Steve. Was it the Happy Planet Index or the Canadian Index of Well-Being? All of these are sort of indexes that that try to build in ways to include these non-monetary impacts. So, and this is the solution that the theoretical framework proposes to respond to that challenge, which is that we need to use a metric that best captures each of these different impacts. For most economic changes, as well as some of the social changes with clear monetary costs, money is the appropriate metric. But there are other social impacts that can be captured and described in more straightforward ways as a percentage change or as a change in numbers. So then the next challenge is aggregating the impacts, because, you know, from a traditional cost-benefit analysis, you take all the positive costs and you take all the negative costs and you say, well, this is bigger than this, and there you go, it's a benefit. And that's what cost-benefit analysis is designed to do. But the approach is problematic because of the difficulties applying monetary values to social changes, but also because it requires something to be either or. It requires something to be a benefit or something to be a cost. And things can't just be changes, or they can't just be impacts. And so the other side of the coin, of course, is that these other sort of indexes that try to build in the social or non-quantifiable piece are theoretically more satisfying, but they tend to be somewhat arbitrary because there's quite a bit of disagreement about, you know, how you would weight the economic versus the social, and also people have different views about, you know, what's important from a social perspective. So in terms of aggregating the impacts, the monetary changes with clear costs and gains can be combined, but other changes are best reported as they are and not combined. And what you end up with at the end is a profile of impacts with different indices for different impacts. So there is certainly value, and we intend to apply the relevant basic economic principles to evaluate the economic impacts of expanded gaming in Massachusetts. But it's only going to be a true economic benefit if the new form of gambling causes an influx of money or assets from outside the jurisdiction, increases the value of existing assets, you know, whether it's housing or property values or whatever it is, and increases the utilization of existing money. So those are sort of the net impacts that Dan Hodge talked about when he and I appeared here at the end of March. So now we're going to walk through a whole bunch of question marks about how you do an impact assessment, or some of the questions that come up. So one of the key issues that comes up is how large a geographic area to assess, because most studies have looked very closely only at the area where the gaming venues have been introduced, and they haven't really considered the larger regional impacts. And, you know, at the very highest level, I guess we could say that it would be of interest to think about how the introduction of casino gaming in Massachusetts is going to affect the New England region, because, you know, we have a lot of other states that are adjacent, and all of them are going to be, you know, maneuvering around, and, you know, the issue is, where does Massachusetts fit in that larger environment? Because essentially, in many cases, increased financial inflow into one region comes at the expense of financial outflow from other regions. And in fact, as I followed the debates here in Massachusetts, that recapture of the 30% of revenues that are Massachusetts people going to Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun was a very important part of the equation. So socioeconomic analyses in the theoretical framework are intended to examine the geographic magnitude of the impact and to estimate both community-specific impacts and macro or regional impacts. And that's one of the reasons why we're very interested in doing these employee surveys and patron surveys and license plate surveys, so that we can actually figure out, you know, what the geographic pieces to the puzzle are. So another issue is how long a time span to assess, because most of the impact studies that have been done of gambling have really been done after the fact. There's never been a study that got a clean baseline before this one. But there's also the issue of the length of time that it takes for all of the economic and social impacts to roll out. And essentially that's unknown. Many of the economic impacts are fairly immediate. You know, you get construction jobs, you get you know, a big property, you get people coming in and spending money because it's exciting and, you know, you want to check it out. But other even economic impacts take some years to manifest, and others may even reverse with time. And certainly we've seen this with Atlantic City, where, you know, there was lots of money for a lot of years, and then, boy, you know, hard times hit. And Nevada, too, is not a recession-proof economy, as many people had assumed it was for so many years. So another issue is that new gambling venues are always added to existing opportunities, even if those are illegal opportunities. And there are lag effects of those pre-existing opportunities that can be mistaken for immediate impacts. And so you need to sort of keep your eye on the ball, if you will, for much longer than most of the existing studies have done in order to kind of watch those impacts play out over time. So it's important to document prior gambling opportunities and effects for several years before the opening of the new venue, as well as for several years after. And that is what we intend to do. We intend to look at the impacts going back a number of years. So all of our secondary indicators, we're looking at how far do we think we actually need to go back, because most of the team at the kickoff meeting, I think, agreed that we needed to look well before the recession of 2008 to be able to get more of a picture of what's been going on in Massachusetts. Okay. So then there are the difficulties of isolating the effects of gambling. And, you know, sort of these pre-post designs. So you do, you look before the introduction and you look after the introduction. That kind of research design ignores the fact that there are really a multitude of different forces at work that can account for social and economic changes. And a much stronger methodology is what's called a matched control comparison, where changes in the community receiving the gambling venue are compared against changes in an economically, socially, and demographically similar community that didn't receive new gambling venues. And the theoretical framework proposes that it's important to use both pre-post and control community comparisons. And in fact, a lot of our discussions around the sampling strategy that we've had in the team have been around how are we going to be able to construct those control communities. because we want to have we don't know what the applicants' communities are going to be. We have some kind of like loose guess, but we need to be able to sort of say, okay, of these 11 or 14 communities, depending on, what you count in Region C, are we going to look for exact matches? Are we going to try to, so there's a number of discussions that we've had about how we're going to do that. And I think once the research director is on staff and in-house, that we'll want to bring him on board with those particular discussions. So, again, there are limitations to cross-sectional designs, these sort of, snapshots, in year 1 and snapshot in year 6. But most impact studies collect these annual indicators and then try to attribute changes to the introduction of the new gambling activity. But it's an open question because you have correlational data, that is, things are changing together, but you don't know for a fact that they're linked because you don't have someone saying, yes, I experienced a bankruptcy because of my gambling problems. And so we actually are addressing that somewhat in our primary data collection by getting people to give us attributions of that kind. But it is a challenge for doing this kind of study. And then, so this is a series of slides about, impacts are specific. They are specific to different segments of society. And you really have to have large enough samples to be able to look at important subgroups in the population over time. So, for example, if a 5% of the population that we estimate could be classified as problem gamblers experiences a 100% increase in bankruptcy, that change is not going to be statistically significant. And so that's the reason why it's very important to have very large samples, and we discussed this at length. But it's also important to oversample subpopulations that are most at risk. And this is another of the issues that we're dealing with in our sampling strategy discussions, is looking at ways to essentially stratify our sample so that we are oversampling geographic areas in the state where we think there might be more problem gamblers based on, demographic and social and economic indicators.
The study that Marlene has just done should be helpful on that.
We can talk about that.
Right.
The prevalence rate that was identified in that study was, I think, affected significantly by the methodology that was used. And so we're working with Marlene and Phil on sort of redoing the analysis a little bit, but I don't think we're going to be able to account for that the impact of using an online sample is huge. So some of the impacts are quite specific to the type of gambling that's being introduced, because different types of gambling are associated with different rates of problem gambling. Lotteries, if you look at problem gambling rates amongst past year lottery players, they pretty much look the same as the rest of the population because so much of the population plays the lottery. When you start looking at problem gambling rates amongst internet gamblers, the prevalence rates are extremely high. And that's because most people who gamble on the internet are simply adding that form of gambling to a much larger suite of gambling activities that they do. And there's different economic spin-offs associated with different types of gambling. Rob talked a good bit about the importance of where new gambling venues are located in terms of the impact on new versus cannibalized job creation and revenues, but also the impact on problem gambling rates in the local population. And so Rob is from Alberta, and he was coming from a place where in Alberta there's actually 29 casinos in a much larger area, but much more sparsely populated than Massachusetts. But this is something that we've seen elsewhere. And the takeaway message is really that it's important to qualify the results as being specific to the type of gambling that you're studying. I'm just going to go very quickly through these, that the impacts are somewhat specific to the jurisdiction. You know, Alberta has 29 casinos. We're going to have 3 plus a slot parlor. So you need to qualify your results as being specific to that jurisdiction, and then also specific to the time period studied. There's another study that Rob and I completed last year that shows that in the wake of a major introduction, you get quite a steep increase in the rate of problem gambling for about 10 years, and then it kind of starts to diminish even if you add new forms of gambling. And so we know that there are some different things that are going on in populations that need to be attended to. I've gotten myself way ahead of I forgot to turn the pages. So this is my last slide, that in terms of the theoretical framework, the results need to speak to both changes from baseline and changes relative to what the current situation would be without gambling. And that's another reason why it's very important to have not just a pre-post design, but also a case control design as well. And so that's what we are currently looking at. And then I have this other section of the presentation, which is essentially, I think it was in the RFR that we were asked to identify potential challenges and then propose our solutions to them. And so these were some of the ideas that we had. So let's see. Right. This is probably the most important, because even though we have a big team with 14 people on it at the moment, this is not a study that we're going to be able to do by ourselves. We are going to need to establish good collaborative working relationships with a lot of different people around the Commonwealth. And in fact, I've done more travel in Massachusetts in the last 2 months than I think I had done in the last 5 years, driving around to various meetings and just trying to get acquainted with people who are hopefully going to be interested in collaborating with us. We definitely need the cooperation of the venue operators. That's going to be critical for a great deal of the work that we're going to be doing on their properties. And we also are going to rely on them and on the commission, I believe, to get a wide range of data about their operations, so that we actually can tease out the economic impacts of these venues. We're going to need the cooperation of everybody who's involved in problem gambling treatment or prevention, because that's going to be critical for our ability to be able to identify the numbers of people who are seeking help, where they're coming from, how much that treatment is costing, and I would say actually the treatment piece is, I've been thinking that we need to establish good relations with not just the Department of Public Health or Health and Human, or the Bureau of Substance Abuse Services, but we actually need to sort of think more broadly about where in the health system do we think problem gamblers might turn up, and how can we get people to effectively screen for a gambling problem. whether they're coming into the prison system or they're coming to their GP or they're, looking for some help with, depression medications. We know that most problem gamblers do not turn up for treatment for a gambling problem. They turn up for a whole bunch of other things. And we need to think very systematically about how we're going to kind of capture that information and feed it back into the health system so that people can be, effectively helped. And then finally, we're going to need help from problem gamblers themselves, because that's going to be absolutely critical to our ability to be able to say what's happening here in Massachusetts, how does it sort of array against what's known as, in terms of best practices for the treatment of problem gambling, and how can we then align what's happening in Massachusetts with what we know works best from an international perspective.
Rachel, on that
Yes.
first point, you sent us, I think, some very helpful comments on what needs to be in the regs, right, which you have. And that'll be in the next phase of regs, right? Yeah, we'll be doing
Okay.
another set of regs, so that's very helpful. But when we get to that drafting, we'll make sure that you guys.
Absolutely, yeah, and our team, was really excited to be able to send that
Great.
document to the commission.
Great. That's really helpful.
And in fact, I think Commissioner Zuniga said that we had until tomorrow to get
Actually-
some additional language to you.
Well, actually, a lot more. Just
Oh, a
what the
lot.
chairman is referring to, there's a third phase, phase 2B or phase 3, more relative to operations.
Okay.
That we are already thinking about.
Okay.
Where a lot of what you provided, the comments that you provided may really reside.
Okay.
They're
just
already
want-
very helpful, but there's a lot that pertains to the next phase.
Okay, well, that's good to know, because, we sort of produced that document, I won't say in a tearing hurry, but we did it very quickly, and there were a number of comments that Natasha would like to add. Lori Salemi also had some comments that she would like to add as well, so there's...
There's time to do that, yeah.
Okay,
There's
time to do
plenty of
that.
time.
That's good.
But we were particularly concerned about making sure that I know the bidders have read, the applicants have read the law, so they know what's in there.
Right.
But we really wanted to raise their attention to it, so this was not a surprise to them when they
Right.
look for, they find out the kind of information we're looking for.
Right,
So the
it's,
details of that, we've got time to flesh out.
Yeah, it's a, and I think it can be done. I think that, the way things are rolling out here in Massachusetts is pretty unique, but everybody seems to be interested in being cooperative and collaborative, and I think that's a good place to start from.
Great.
So I had to scratch out these dates based on your earlier meeting, but you can see every single one of them has a question mark next to it. Yeah, the gambling venues opening at different times really is, I know it's a challenge for you, it's really a challenge for us too, because of the design that we had proposed in terms of these targeted population surveys, where really we want to drill down, right down to the host community and adjacent community level, to be able to look at these impacts. And so, we're going to do this big baseline survey, and we know we're going to do a big follow-up replication survey, once everybody's been up and running for a couple of years. But the challenge here is that the staggered openings could result in sort of a 2 to 3 year rollout period. And the problem that creates is that it's going to be necessary to conduct the post-evaluation after all 4 venues have opened and have been open for at least a year, because problem gambling screens are typically 12-month screens. So we have to wait a year to actually do our survey. But that then, so the challenge creates, well, so there's the methodological issue of when are we going to do our follow-up survey. But then there's also the challenge of trying to figure out how we're going to tease out, because we know problem gambling rates increase and then decrease. And so so some of these communities will have sort of 1 year of operation under their belts. Another community might have 3 years of operation under their belts. And so we're going to have to be thinking very strategically as we go forward, not immediately, but we are aware that this is going to be an issue and a challenge. And so we're starting to think about how we're going to kind of construct those subsequent surveys so that we can actually really pin down those impacts with some certitude. I think this is the one where I've never seen Rob Williams stop in his tracks quite so suddenly. It was a wonder to behold. The issue is that because most of the social and economic impact studies of gambling that have been done are fairly limited in terms of time frame, many of the impacts the full impacts are typically not captured by the end of the study. And many of the impacts, the economic impacts are fairly immediate. I mean, you're going to get jobs, you're going to get revenues, you're going to get tourism, and those are pretty quick. But for example, it often takes years for competing industries to fail. You know, so what's the impact going to be on the lottery? What's the impact going to be on racing? What's the impact going to be on bingo and charitable activities? Or for increased utilization of public services and roads and sewers to result in repairs. So some of these economic impacts may also reverse themselves in a resilient economy as industries reposition. So, you know, there's sort of the question of when you're going to stop was perhaps answered by Steve when he said that it was clear, or that the commission intended this study to continue beyond the original 6 years that we had proposed, and that to sort of facilitate this ability to watch the impacts roll out over time. I believe the phrase you used, Steve, was in perpetuity.
Yeah. But that's what the legislature said. It's not me talking, you know,
Yeah.
that's what the legislature calls for and provides a funding. I mean, they can always change it, which could happen, but the whole idea is to have something that tracks this as long as we have the industry.
And I'll tell you, that it's like, and when I was here at the end of March, and I talked a little bit at the beginning after Commissioner McHugh asked me to speak a little bit more personally about my excitement about being here. You know, that truly is what I think is a vision that I've had for many, many years of how do you set up a monitoring system that is going to, you know, monitor the industry and make sure that the benefits are maximized and the impacts are minimized, the negative impacts are minimized. And the only way you can really do that is to have empirical evidence that you watch change over time and then, you know, try your tweaks and see what happens.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Researchers nirvana.
Yes, absolutely. It's really, I have to say, it's a real privilege. I'm deeply honored that I'm able to be here. So this, I think I'm getting close to the end here. So some of the key data may be unavailable in 2018. Certain data takes longer to collect and report, particularly suicide data and crime data. And so we had originally proposed a subset of activities that would address the crime issue. There were actually contractual reasons why that turned out to be not the best solution. And so we do want to kind of rethink that piece. But what we're thinking of at this point is that it's going to be very important for us to figure out a way to work with the relevant law enforcement and criminal justice agencies to be able to get the information that we would like to get on, crime impacts in the communities, and then regionally, and then, statewide. But I think that's a conversation. The data are being collected as we speak, so I think it's a conversation that can wait until we're actually in the field on the survey. This is another big issue, is the limited controlled comparisons. Because with the exception of New Hampshire and Vermont, all of the other northeastern states already have casinos or slot parlors, and actually New Hampshire is considering casinos. We're also concerned because really Vermont and New Hampshire have much smaller and more rural economies, and so with the exception of maybe Western Mass, it's going to be hard to find a comparator for Boston, for example. And yeah, I think I'll leave that one. So we're trying to figure that one out, the limited controlled comparisons. I mean, we can look in other jurisdictions, we can look at, at other U.S. states, or we can look at even internationally, but we have to make sure that we've got a good way to make the case of why we're looking at those communities. So that's the work that we're doing there. The judgment of the overall impacts may be somewhat subjective. I think actually that's a good thing. I don't think that as a researcher, I can interpret the data and I can tell you what I think, but at the end of the day, I think it's up to people to to make their own judgments. And different people are going to make different judgments. Different people are going to think that the economic benefits are really important, and okay, so you have some social impacts that are negative. Other people are going to be, for whatever reason, for personal reasons or moral reasons, ethical reasons, are going to be focused on the subjective, the social impacts, the negative social impacts, and they're going to say, all that money, it's still not worth it. And people, from my perspective, the important thing is to put out information in a number of ways so that, people can access it and people can make those judgments themselves. So, we're not just going to have like a massive, report that we dump on your desk and say, okay, here it is, and off we go. We actually plan to develop a whole communication strategy around, how are we going to speak to, selectmen? How are we going to speak to concerned citizens? Fact sheets and various things like that. So we do want the information to get out there. We're not just going to put this in academic publications.
And we're going to try to create data sets that other researchers can access too, right, over this
Absolutely,
same
yeah.
period of time.
Yeah. So that's actually a part of the tasks that I didn't talk about. But yes, we plan to make the results and the data from this study as widely available as we can. Oh, I guess that's my presentation.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Yeah, I had a question about your aversion to cost-benefit analysis in a number of cases. I understand the point that increase in suicides and some things ought to be reported as such, percentage increases. But I'm concerned that there are a lot of social trends today that are not, to which no cost is associated, with which no cost is associated, with the consequence that public policy is skewed in a way that's unhelpful. I think about two examples that immediately come to mind, and that is our method for addressing gun control and our method for addressing incarceration rates. We tend, in the latter case, to look at the cost of housing somebody in a jail or prison, and we tend to take a look at the costs of building, and the costs of staffing the prisons that we build. But we totally overlook the economic consequences of taking somebody out of the stream of commerce for a particular period of time, and the ripple economic effects that has, which really conceals a great deal of the true cost of an incarceration policy. The similar thing is true of gun control. And I say this without taking one side or the other, but it just seems to me to have the debate, you need to have an estimate of what the true costs are. And in terms of the way we approach gun control, we overlook the economic cost of the deaths. We overlook the cost of fortifying America to defend against the random consequences of firearms proliferation. We overlook the public health costs that are socialized across our healthcare system. All of those are quantifiable, albeit with some assumptions. It's been done in other industries. The seatbelt assessment was based on assigning an economic value to death and injury and then measuring it against the cost of putting seatbelts in cars. And so while I understand the need and desirability of reporting an increased suicide rate as an increased suicide rate, I wonder why it can't have both an economic cost and a social cost measured by its very existence. And why, in many of these categories, we can't do this thoughtful, thorough assessment that you're planning, and with some assumptions, make economic assessments of the cost of it. Because otherwise, it seems to me that all these things stay as an externality that really isn't addressed in the policy making as with as sharp a bite, I guess, as it could be if some economic value were assigned to it.
Well, I guess I would respond by saying that we absolutely do intend to assign monetary value to everything that we can reasonably do that with. And so, you know, if we have to make assumptions, we will certainly spell those out. But, you know, the theoretical framework that we've proposed for this study tries to take account of the fact that in many of these cost-benefit analyses, and many of, you know, in that traditional approach, what happens is if it can't be counted, then it isn't counted. And
Which
so
is
that's...
Jim's point.
And so that's why, at the very least, we want to sort of move these issues, you know, into some kind of a balance sheet. So, you know, I think, you know, it's dangerous to turn, or it's tempting to turn everything into a number, but sometimes sometimes it's more important to just at least put it on the table and say, okay, how are we going to think about this? And we certainly have the economists on board to help us value.
Yeah, I hear you, and I guess it's a question of emphasis, and I guess the only thing in direct response to what you're saying is, I hope we don't find too quickly that things can't be counted, and therefore we have to treat them simply as they are, because I think, I've said it, I think we underestimate often the costs in dollars as well as social impact of things in ways that skews the public debate. And I think this is a really important, I think it's really important here not to do that, as it is in other areas. But we have a chance, because you're here and we're getting it on the ground floor, to really take a hard look at things that would inform social policy.
And I guess I would say that I am not an economist, and so I kind of wish I had Dan here at the table. But we fully intend, half of our team are economists, and so, you know, we definitely plan to have those discussions and figure out, you know, everything that can be quantified will be quantified to the extent that we can, you know, make our assumptions, you know, very clear to everyone, you know, what we assumed as we were making those numbers.
This is a really interesting conversation, but this is something that we will be participating in. You know, we'll be hearing this, and we'll be able to talk about it, so, and track it and probe ourselves on the points you're making.
Well, I was going to draw the distinction between doing one study in perpetuity versus my nuanced read of that notion in the legislation is that there's an annual research agenda that will be funded and that has funding, and we can do, and we can modify, and commissions after us can modify, and with the advice of the Gaming Policy Advisory Committee. So the ongoing process is important, but that doesn't mean that there's just this one study. There will be a number of additional variables that would have to be studied, restudied, or modified, et cetera. So,
Yeah, that's a very important point, is that, you know, this is just the beginning of a process rather than, you know, just a
just the one thing
single
we're
point
measuring
in time.
always.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Anybody else? Anything else?
So, thank you very much.
Thank you, great stuff.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming
Thank
in.
you.
Okay, should I hang around for the rest of the meeting, or maybe not?
It's up to you.
You won't hurt our feelings if you leave.
Drive back to Western Mass.
Right. Okay, Captain, Madam General Counsel.
Steve, should we do this right here? It should be before we
Oh.
start to get into the regs.
Yeah, I suppose we might as well.
Sorry,
Yeah, it's all right.
sorry.
Well, I think we're gonna need some of the same. This came in this morning, and I haven't read the full,
Last night.
I haven't
Started
seen it.
online
What
last
is it?
night.
this, they, you have it to show?
I believe I do.
It's basically the letter from Springfield
Yeah.
with the notice that they
10?
proposed.
Yeah.
Yeah, 10.
Oh, this is what- yeah. Yeah.
I think we're supposed to approve the question, right, which is why I guess it's here. Because this is, yeah, this is the input, the summary that they're gonna distribute, and the referendum question that they will issue.
And up before the commission is just the notice regarding the election before suitability.
Right. Well, do we have to approve it? I mean,
Yes.
we've said if they do such and such, then they can do it, right?
So our regulation requires prior approval of the commission of the
Okay.
notice that gets sent out to voters. And at the meeting where we discussed this, I think what the commission recommended was that staff would have interactions with the communities, and then we would present the recommendation to the commission. Catherine, Todd, and I have worked with both the applicant and the community on the language of this, and it's consistent with our regulation, and we believe it accomplishes the missions of the commission.
Is there a need to do this today?
The applicant and the community want to get out some of these notifications very quickly, and there's an upcoming meeting of the city council on Monday to look over these documents, including the notice. Sorry.
You have to-
Yes.
Well, yeah.
It's a long way to say yes.
Polite way to say,
Very polite.
thoughtful way to say yes. Okay.
So the notice, the letter will be sent to all voters, all registered voters, and the notice gets posted? What does the notice do?
Yeah, so the notice will accompany the letter.
It will, okay.
Yep. basically the letter reiterates what's included in the notice. And the notice includes the specific statute regarding our background investigations.
And then the last item is how it will actually appear on the ballot.
Yes.
That's not actually, that's just more informational, that is not, that's not before the commission.
But the, just to be clear about this, the letter said, I'm just scanning it, but I think the letter says, with this letter, we're providing the ballot question, which is the last page.
Yeah.
I don't think it says it's including the notice, does it?
Yeah, it's part of the packet.
So this
Marty,
will-
feel free to help me out if you want. It says, the notice says that, please carefully read the enclosed material, and all of the material, including the notice, is included within the cover letter.
Okay, fine, all right. Yeah,
But the question, we don't get to approve. The question is a summary of the city solicitor.
Yeah, so all we're
Right. And
really
we have to
looking at is
approve
the
this.
notice.
It's a notice.
is the letter and the notice, yeah, right.
And if you'd like, I could read from you the section of our regulations that governs this, if you'd
Yeah,
like.
why don't you just for the, okay.
A host community may not hold an election in accordance with MGL Chapter 23, Section 1513, until the commission has issued a positive determination of suitability to the applicant in accordance with 205 CMR 115.053, unless the following conditions are satisfied. Prior to the request by the applicant for an election in accordance with 205 CMR 124.021, the governing body of the community formally approves the holding of the election prior to a positive determination of suitability having been issued to the applicant by the commission. That has occurred in this case.
Right.
And then at the expense of the applicant prior to the election, the community has conducted a process for informing the community about the commission's determination of suitability, standards and procedures, which shall include but not be limited to the provision of a notice designed to be received by voting households within the community, informing such households that an election is to be held for which the applicant has yet to be issued a positive determination of suitability, that the commission will make its determination of suitability after completing a thorough background investigation of the applicant, its principal operating officers and investors, and that the commission will not permit the applicant or its principal operating officers or investors to proceed with the application unless it determines that they are suitable to operate gaming facility in Massachusetts. The content of the notice shall be forwarded to the commission for approval prior to dissemination, and I'll dispense with the rest of the section. And all of the standards and the language that I just referenced are included in that notice.
Comments, thoughts, anybody?
I think it conforms to, the staff has recommended we approve it, I think it conforms to the requirements. It's a little legalese, but unless we dictate the language, we're gonna get variants of that from everybody, everybody's gonna do it in slightly different ways, so.
And I actually thought, I mean, the notice is obviously particularly legal easy, but I thought the letter was pretty well written, actually. It comes across pretty well. So I'd be inclined to approve it.
Yes, I am inclined to. I think it conforms to the standards. I read it along with the regs, and I think it's
Okay.
in compliance with what the intention was.
Have a motion?
I move to approve the notice of compliance, the City of Springfield's notice of a host community election in advance of a determination of suitability in the form submitted to us today.
Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marty.
Now.
Save the best for last?
Yeah.
Of course.
Before you start, I think the audience should know that every single comment that you all out there submitted to us on the regs has been put into a matrix in its totality, matched up against the actual, the reg which is being commented on, and then we have a series of places where council of various types have made recommendations. So anybody who submitted thoughts, questions, every single one of them has been looked at. And it's, you guys did a phenomenal job. I mean, this is an incredible, massive task. You folks and Anderson Krieger did a great job. So take it over.
We have before you today the final version, we hope, of the Phase 2 regs. I want to just say to the commission, before we start, that this charge has largely been led by Mr. Grossman. He has done a masterful job in putting these regs together, so I just want to let you know he's worked very hard, and I think they've turned out very, very well. So we are open to approaching this discussion however you like. We can go through the changes. Todd has suggested we go through some of the very recent changes we made in the last day or so, or we can walk through all of them, whichever is your preference. I know Mr. Grossman has a couple of areas he probably wants to bring to your attention, but we can handle it whichever way is most comfortable for you.
I was hoping and making the suggestion that we perhaps take broad themes one at a time, surrounding community, for example, and you can either give a brief overview of the most recent changes or rather a general overview of the approach, brief discussion on recent changes, et cetera, and have opportunity for questions. Rather than trying to go one at a time, because there's, for one, I had an opportunity to do some of that already, quite a bit of that already, with Mr. Grossman. So I just wanted to put that suggestion out there.
Trouble is, that would put us random back and forth, and
Well, not if we did a major topic, let's say, by virtue of the major sections of the regulations.
I'm not quite sure how you do that, but I'm okay with it. I'm not quite sure how you would do that.
Would it help to start with the two new pieces that you gave us today?
That would be a simple way to start.
I think that might be, then we can easily break it down by kind of subject matter that way, which would include surrounding communities, the application process, evaluation, things along those lines. So why don't we start with just a brief bit of background as to what you have before you. You will see a document that is multicolored, as most of our works are. And in this case, there are, aside from the black, there are three colors. The first are languages in red, which indicates that it's new language from that which presently exists. Then you have green language, which are amendments to the draft based upon the written comments that we've received and other review that we have conducted. And then finally, what you have before you just today are changes in blue. And they're fairly minimal, and I didn't copy the whole packet for you, just the pages that had changes that you may not have yet seen, which are largely based on discussions I had and we had with staff and the commissioners themselves. And we're happy to walk you through those changes and some of the bigger subject areas, so everyone has a good understanding as to what the regulations say and what we think they say anyway. And certainly as we go through, if there are any comments that were made that you'd like to address, we could do that as well. Certainly, though, as the chair pointed out, all the comments were carefully reviewed and considered. They were very thoughtfully done and tremendously helpful in us in preparing these regulations that I think cover everything we need them to cover. And the comments helped us improve the readability and the understandability of our language. But certainly not every comment was incorporated in here. So as we go through, if there are any comments that you recall seeing that aren't reflected in the draft, we're happy to discuss that and why we elected not to incorporated. So with that, perhaps we can start with the updates to the existing regs. So that's sections 102 through 117. The first thing I would just note on page 2, we have, someone had suggested perhaps that we define what vulnerable populations means for purposes of compulsive gambling. And I did have a brief interaction or exchange with Marlene from the Mass Compulsive Gambling Council. And we didn't have a lot of time to discuss this, so at this point, based upon her comment and my recommendation would just be to remove this definition, that we can certainly make efforts after further communications with those folks to describe perhaps via policy or something what we mean by vulnerable populations, but it was too difficult to try to craft a definition of that term on the fly without putting some serious thought into it. So I certainly wouldn't recommend that we define the term right now.
But we have a regulation that uses that term.
Well, that is in the statute, and it basically, I think
Also in the reg.
Well, we mirrored the statute in our reg. So certainly, I think we will have to provide some guidance as to what that means, but I don't think we're prepared to do it right now. Well, and I would just add to that by saying the reason why we're not prepared is that there is no, my understanding, industry standard as to what a vulnerable population is. If you do some research on it, you'll see that there are groups that have historically been identified as perhaps fitting into that category, but it seemed to me that we might be trailblazers in that area if we were to sit and define what that term means here.
Yeah, I just have a concern about putting a regulation in that uses a term that we can't define. Whether we're taking this term out of the statute or inventing it anew. And I think we either take it out both places and let the statutory term stand on its own, or we wrestle with a definition. We've got a few more days to wrestle with a definition. We could be authorized by, you could be authorized by the commission to work further on it. Perhaps circulate it, and if somebody seriously objected, that person could call a meeting between now and next Thursday when we have to publish these. But I just don't think it's a good idea to publish a regulation containing a term we can't define that has some consequences. So I would recommend, I understand the difficulty of it, but I'd recommend that we empower you and to work on work on a definition, even if we may have to revise it at some point. Circulate it, and if there's no objection, we publish that as the existing reg and deal with any amendments later on.
We can certainly do that.
Did Ms. Warner find the term objectionable?
I just don't think she was, I don't want to speak for her, we only emailed each other really briefly, but I think she just wasn't prepared to kind of sign off on the language that we had. Perhaps with a few more days, we might be able to do that.
Well, and it's ultimately up to us. I mean, we take advice and guidance from the outside, but it's up to us to come up with a definition. So it seems to me that that's what we ought to do.
Not by me. Anybody object?
No, that's fine.
All right. You want to go ahead with with others?
You'll see that on page 4, so now I'm in the new packet. I'm sorry. This is section 102.06.
The packet you passed out this
The
morning?
small one, yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Good.
The blue, in the blue.
yeah.
Okay, that page right there. And the matter is not provided for, we just clarified who would be able to utilize this provision.
Right. And you fixed the disbursement language to fit the new proposal.
We fixed so the disbursement language is, that's
Page
section
24.
114.03 is
Right.
page 24.
Yeah.
That includes the 90-day and 60-day period that you'd have before the RFA 2 submission deadline
This- Sorry.
to apply it for the involuntary disbursement of funds. And this works into the whole surrounding community discussion. This is a critical component, and we received a lot of comments on this type of language. So just to clarify how this fits into the process, what we have said is, as you recall, of course, there are 3 ways in which you could be designated a surrounding community. You can do it by entering, if you're a community, by entering into a surrounding community agreement with the applicant that gets filed with the application. You can get designated as a surrounding community in the application by the applicant, and that would be for a situation in which perhaps the applicant acknowledges that a particular community is a surrounding community. They've been working with them, negotiating with them, but for whatever reason couldn't execute an agreement prior to the submission of the RFA2 application. So in that event, they have acknowledged in the application itself that this is in fact a surrounding community. Assuming that that community assents to that designation, then they would be a surrounding community. The third scenario is one in which the applicant does not agree that a particular community is a surrounding community, so that community petitions the commission within 10 days from the filing of the application, the RFA2 application, to be designated as a surrounding community. The applicant then has 10 days to either assent or oppose to that petition, and at that point the commission will make a determination as to whether that particular community is a surrounding community using all the criteria that we laid out in the regulations, and we'll get to that in a moment because we did make some adjustments to that as well based upon comments. But the reason I bring that up now is the community disbursement part is a critical piece of all of the surrounding community determinations. And there are 2 ways that a community can obtain community disbursements. The first way is by essentially the assent of the applicant. The applicant could certainly agree that a particular community should be provided with certain funds. They sign what we refer to as a letter of authorization with the community for the provision of certain funds for a specific purpose. So that can go on now. It is in fact going on now, and in fact we have granted funds for those purposes to a number of communities. The second way that a community can obtain, oh, and let me just back up for a step. One of the changes that we've made to the voluntary community disbursement section, if you will, is that we have allowed for disbursement of funds to regional planning agencies. And that would be only in the voluntary portion of the community disbursement section. That is, only if the applicant agrees to it. So if the applicant agrees to provide funds to the regional planning agency for purposes of evaluating impacts for a particular region, then they may enter into or sign a letter of authorization. That does not apply to the involuntary process, meaning that the regional planning agency cannot petition against the will of the applicant for funds. So then we get to the so-called involuntary process. The language, of course, doesn't appear in here, but it's just kind of the moniker we've assigned to it. And in that scenario, we say that 21 days after the commission has posted the host community agreement on its website, meaning 21 days essentially after the execution of a host community agreement, a community can petition for the disbursement of funds to study the impacts and to execute an agreement. And the importance of that period of time, and there's no magic to that 30-day date or the 21-day period, but the importance of it was to encourage the parties to get together and try to resolve these issues on their own, and not have a community come directly to the commission seeking funds without having first asked the applicant for the monies. So that's why we thought it important to include a buffer period, if you will. And then we included the language, which is based upon the public comment that was on our website recently, and we got a number of comments on, that would allow for communities to petition, whether it's 90 days or 60 days, based upon whether it's a Category 1 or Category 2, in the event that they're running up against the RFA 2 deadline. So that's the language in blue that you'll see on page 24 to account for that change. Then the community has to make a showing to the commission that it meets all the criteria in the balancing test. And it's essentially a two-part test, where first it has to demonstrate that, let me just pull it out here. There's a reasonable likelihood that the community will be designated a surrounding community. So not just any community can come in and petition, they'd have to make a showing of likelihood of success, if you will. And then that they will not be able to properly determine the impacts of the proposed gaming establishment without the requested funds. And that outweighs the burden of the actual financial cost. There's actually one other element that I left out that I meant to include, which is that the petitioner would also have to demonstrate that the request is reasonable in scope. And that is in response to a number of comments we received as well, which suggested that this process is too open-ended. So that would give the community, the commission, the flexibility to evaluate the nature of these requests and ensure that they're reasonable in light of the purpose of these funds, which is to determine the impact of the proposed gaming establishment to negotiate community mitigation agreements. So those are the changes essentially that we made to the community disbursement section since you've seen it last. This would now, so basically this process would start or could start really now, and in any event, no later than whether it's either 60 days or 90 days prior to the RFA2 application being submitted, or even within 21 days after the host community agreement being executed. So it's not, so though communities do only have 10 days after the submission of the RFA2 application to submit an actual petition, there is, they have a number of months prior to that time to begin the process.
Is the part about, I missed something, is the part about reasonable in scope in here, where is that?
It's not in there. I think we need to add that in. So that would be in, on page 25, that would be in little 2.
Right.
So there's a third test, right?
It would be part, yeah, it would be a
Part two
third
of-
element. I think
yeah.
it's really part of the second one, but it would just clarify that an additional consideration that will be looked at. And then, of course, we added the emergency regulation that Mr. Ziemba just read onto section 115, which starts on page 28. So there are certainly other changes that we have recommended in here. Those, I think, are the highlights.
Okay, can we go to page 21 for a second, 108.032?
Yes.
And I'd recommend in the second line of that, taking out reasonably, you're either aware or you're not aware, you're not reasonably aware, and we covered that with the blue language. And I'm not sure what the green language means. The request shall have been reasonably related to the proposed development of a gaming institution establishment in Massachusetts. The idea here was if somebody called up and asked for a donation to the Little Wanderers Home or something, if it came from a municipal official, then we wanted it to be reported. I thought at least that was our policy discussion. And not provide some direct nexus to a gaming establishment, which is often difficult to determine. So if we had something that said the request shall have, that was geographically limited, the request shall have been I just don't know what that means.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think the intent is to limit the request that the commission would require to ones in Massachusetts, and not that you're interested in any request
Yeah.
these companies have received worldwide.
Right.
And, yeah, I think, as we discussed, I think we do need to adjust that to perhaps clarify that point. But that's the intent
Yeah.
of that language.
Right.
Not necessarily that it has to be gaming related or something like that.
Right, but we don't, if somebody calls up from Singapore and wants something done in Singapore, we don't need to know that.
Right.
So let's put that on the agenda for just clarifying that language a little bit to make that clearer.
Are you through running through the ones you were gonna run through?
In this, yes.
Yeah, for this, these
Right.
recent submissions, okay.
Just the first of the recent submissions.
In the first
Right.
pack.
I mean, there's two little,
Yeah.
two thin packets.
Right, I thought we did the other one.
Thinnest we did.
Thinnest.
So you're looking at the updates now?
Yes, why don't we now look at the updates to 118 through 131.
I thought we just did that, okay.
No, that was 102 to 117.
No, it wasn't?
It wasn't?
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Oh, I know, I'm kidding.
All right, so the first one we did here had to do, and this was, again, in response to one of the questions we posed on our website and sought public input on. Page 3, 118-01, we say that contemporaneous or prior to submitting the RFA2 application, the applicant shall forward a copy of the completed studies and reports referenced in the regulations to each of the communities on the list that we've compiled. So each community will have an opportunity, if they haven't already conducted studies, to have the studies in order to make their case as to whether they are or are not a surrounding community.
That's fine. Okay.
Okay, yeah, I have, mine is, I think was stapled incorrectly.
No, it's not every page.
It
It
just
goes
starts
from
on-
3 to 6.
Starts on,
It only,
See, I got it.
You have two of the same.
Well, yeah, but this is
Oh.
a thicker one,
All
so
right,
I'm
we'll
just
go to
not sure.
page 3. Bottom of page 3.
It's correct, yeah. So it's the wrong one.
Yep, so that's 102 through 117. Try
Yeah, this says-
right here.
That's not the latest.
That's not the latest
Yeah.
one.
Somehow I have the wrong one.
Look at mine.
Yeah, we can share.
We can check.
We have a,
We happen to have a spare.
oh, you do? Thank you very much.
All right.
okay, that doesn't seem controversial to me, so that's fine. So let's go to page 6.
Okay. Page 6. Now, this one, someone made a comment about the fact that we didn't really specify who from the applicant would be required to be at the statutory public hearing. So the thought was here, and that we add language which is akin to, in legal terms, what we call a 30B6 deposition, where basically the applicant would be required to have someone there who has knowledge of the application and is prepared to answer questions. Realistically speaking, it's unlikely that they would have people there who didn't know the answers to questions. But just to clarify that point, we're saying you have to have someone there who's prepared to answer questions. So that's basically what this language is here.
Fine. Page 15. That's just,
I think if we may,
Peanuts.
Mr. Chair, on page 7, there's another important, this is in the thick packet. All right, we'll just stick with those. We'll stick with those, just to make it easy. We'll come back.
Good job.
Yeah, okay.
15 and 16 is just trivial stuff, I think.
Yeah, so those are just clarifying the evaluation process and consistent with the matrix. One of the things we may want to include based on the conversation today is the word overall, right on page 15, 11903, paragraph 2. The sentence right before we get into the list of everything, we say, in no particular order and without assigning any particular weights, the commission will evaluate the applicant's, I would suggest we add, overall response on how it addresses the following categories. Just to address the discussion you had.
So would that be a new color?
That would probably be blue. Hope again.
The Pope again.
All right, and page 16 is little stuff. Page 30, does this is a change in the announcement.
Yes. This one was brought about by a reread of the statute and concern as to the practical effect of the language we had in there, in our regulation. What we say in the this has to do with the publication of the notice of the host community agreement and the summary. And initially, we read the statute to require the publication of not only the summary of the host community agreement, but the host community agreement itself. And after further thought and after further reading the statute, we sense that that is not really necessarily, I don't want to call it illogical, but it's not a practical reading of the statute. Now that we're starting to get some of these host community agreements in, the concept of publishing a copy of the actual agreement in the newspaper doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, and it doesn't seem to be perhaps what the legislature would have contemplated when it wrote that section. And having gone back and read the statute that this regulation is based on, I think the commission could easily interpret that to say that basically you just have to make the host community, the contents of the host community agreement public. And you do that by publishing the summary clearly in a newspaper. And what we have added here is that the agreement itself has to be available on the municipal website. It's going to be on our website. And in all likelihood, it'll be on the applicant's website, though we didn't mandate that. In addition to folks who are inclined to look at a host community agreement online, we say that they have to provide notice and to leave a copy of the agreement at the city or town clerk's office that's available as well. So we're comfortable that that satisfies the requirements of the law. I think it's a more logical reading of the statute and a fair adjustment, and that's based upon public comment moves.
I agree with that analysis, but I think the commission ought to be aware that it's not the only reading of the statute, that the reading that the whole host community agreement has to be published is another way to read that statute. Ultimately, if necessary, a court will decide that. The commission, in this case, like in all cases, has discretion with respect to the way it interprets provisions, particularly ambiguous provisions. This one, as Todd says, Mr. Grossman said, this interpretation makes a great deal of sense. Some of these host community agreements could be 20 or 30 pages.
Yeah.
And to have them, the requirement that I've never seen that, they all be published in a newspaper, doesn't make a lot of sense. They're gonna be on the website. The notice would require that they give the URL in the notice and summary. If anybody wants a hard copy, they'd have to be available at the clerk's office. The notice would have to say that. So this, it seems to me to be a reasonable interpretation of the statute. It's not without some risk.
Does this affect the letter we just approved, or does this relate only to the published notice?
This does not affect that letter. That's a separate issue. But the statute, and in fact our reg, requires that this notice be published 7 days after the execution of the host community agreement. So it would affect Springfield. And I don't remember exactly when they executed the agreement, but it was.
But there's no, that's right, but there's no nexus between the letter that we just approved. That's a standalone deal.
In this?
And
And
it's
this.
Separate issue.
Yeah, it's a different issue.
Okay. I'm fine with it, I mean.
So am I. Do we want to reverse it? So be it.
Right.
Okay, the next, I think, important issue to discuss is the reopening of mitigation agreements. That's on page 44, and we did add some new language in there as well, based upon a public comment we've received. And what we have, there are competing interests at play here with this provision. On the one hand is the right of parties to negotiate an agreement between and amongst themselves and to amend it as they see fit. On the other hand is the interest in preserving the meaningful nature of the host community election. And to the extent that we allow a host community agreement to be amended in any way and at any time, you could certainly erode the whole meaning behind requiring the election. So in an effort to mediate those concerns, we've come up with this section, which provides for situations in which a mitigation agreement, not limited to a host community agreement, but that all agreements could be reopened. And the comments we received seem to suggest that folks thought the opportunity we provided was a little narrow. And in response to that, what we're recommending is that we broaden the opportunity that the parties would have to reopen the agreement. And we broaden it from 2 considerations to 3. The 2 existing ones were essentially if something came up in the MEPA process that was unanticipated, then they could reopen the agreement. Or if something came up in the permitting process that was unanticipated, they could reopen the agreement. And so the third one we've added on is that if there is any occurrence that's likely to cause a significant and material adverse impact, and we define what a significant and material adverse impact is, and we say that that would be the third reason why the parties could reopen an agreement. And there are a couple of reasons why I think we're okay with that and we're comfortable with doing something like that. The first is that to the extent that a community agrees, and this is a mutual reopening, then the folks, the officials from the community are seemingly there to protect the interest of the community, to preserve the intent of the agreement, and to the extent it's a host community, the reason that precipitated the positive vote in the election. So if it's mutual, then that would be the reasoning behind why we'd be okay with it. If it's not mutual, if one party petitions the commission to reopen on the basis that there's a significant and material adverse impact, we wrote in some language in 127.04 that would require the commission to consider the reopener in light of the election, and to ensure that by allowing the amendment, it would not substantially change the project as it was described in the host community agreement or the concise summary provided as part of the ballot. So it gives the commission a gatekeeper role in that regard, in the event that only one party thinks that the agreement should be reopened. And I think that's a fair way to go about this process, in keeping in mind both of the considerations. So that's why we've made those recommendations.
Sounds reasonable to me.
And the parties can contract out in the,
Yes.
in the
Yes.
host community agreement of this entire process.
That's right,
Yes.
that's a great point. In 127.02, we added in additional language, that's on page 44, where, as Commissioner McHugh just mentioned, to the extent that the mitigation agreement provides for it, they can set up whatever system of reopening they want.
Should they?
And the parties, the town vote, the people of the town, city vote.
I don't know if there are any other blue comments.
We haven't even started on 44
I
pages
know.
yet.
We were
No,
working on
we
the
have
blue.
not. Okay, so those are all the blue comments.
Well, I think we ought to just flip through this. I don't see any other way to do it. You know, it may be, not have to go by every single one, because a lot of them, there's nothing to talk about, or may not be anything to talk about. But a number of them, there are policy questions that are being posed. I guess some of you have talked with Todd about this,
Yes.
but I haven't. Has everybody talked to Todd?
Yes.
How come I didn't? What about chopped liver?
It was an optional
Oh.
conversation.
Oh, sorry.
Had to call and get on.
You had
his
to
schedule.
get on his calendar, and I did first.
Jesus. All right, I blew it. Well, then, I guess what were you gonna do? Were you gonna report back on what people said, or how would you do this?
Well, I think this would be a good time to maybe go through the sections one by one here, and I can just point out some of the changes we made. If you've made comments on the grid that aren't reflected in here, or if you have questions as to why we changed certain language, we can kind of hit it, but it might help to just go through it section by section.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, I think by and large, these drafts incorporate a great deal of what you see in there.
Yeah.
So with that, why don't we start with
118?
118 through 131. So this would be the big packet now, and this is the one that was in the Commissioner's packet today. So now we're talking about the green changes. I'm sorry, before we get to the green changes, if we could stop on page 4 and just go to the administrative completeness review. You discussed this issue earlier today, and I think we're going to need to adjust this section. I wanted to make sure I understood the commission's decision. So now we're in 11803, it's paragraph 1, section C, which talks about a negative determination and the ability to cure. My recollection was, I think, that an applicant can cure a deficiency within 7 days, only if it's a material omission.
And material emission is defined as the ones which are legislatively mandated in the evaluation criteria in the flesh-colored highlight.
Yes. That's right.
This, right.
Yeah, the
statutory
minimum
mandate.
requirements, the statutory minimum requirements.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, Section
15.
Okay. Or 14 days if it's non-material.
Right.
Is that
And the
right?
days run from the date of application filing. From the last date of application filing.
Okay.
These are omissions,
Right.
right?
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll adjust that section to include that.
Okay, I certainly, I don't think we need to go through every change unless you'd like to discuss anything in particular. So with that said, I would draw your attention to page 7. So here we talk about when the actual award of the license takes place. There was some question as to what the award meant. And the award is a significant moment because it triggers a number of things, not the
What
least of which-
section are you?
This is
118.
11806.
06, okay.
It's that number 5.
Page 6.
Page 7, oh, is it?
It's, I think,
page-
6 on the copy
page
that you
6.
have.
Yeah.
Oh, I
Yes.
have different page numbers, sorry.
Okay.
Of course, I'm the only one with different page numbers.
We'll look for the green.
The
Right.
green, yes, it's
See,
very
I'm-
bottom
I'm
of
looking
page
at the
6.
blue.
So, so we got comments on this section regarding when is the license awarded? Is it awarded when you vote on it? Is it awarded when the conditions are satisfied? And so the change that we added to the bottom here says that the license is awarded notwithstanding conditions when you vote. So it will be immediate upon the vote to award.
30 days starts to,
Yeah, so payment is 30 days
Yeah.
after.
Yeah.
Clock starts ticking right then.
yes.
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 And do you want to talk about the changes we didn't make to adjudicatory and legislative? Because we got a great
Yeah, I'd
deal
like
of
to know how
comments
you
on
did.
this
How you resolve that,
concept
yeah.
of adjudicatory
Sure.
versus legislative.
We elected not to adjust that. We think our analysis is correct. And in fact, we discuss the actual analysis in these charts here, towards the back, if you'd like to see the actual case law and.
The blue book?
Well, it's in both the blue and the
Blue and
red,
red.
but it's the same analysis for both. And basically, we don't believe that it is an adjudicatory proceeding for a number of reasons. It's impractical to consider it that way, although you could if you wanted to, I suppose. But it would lead to some impractical results, such as the possibility of opening the proceedings to different discovery mechanisms, to different avenues of appeal at different times that were unintended, to cross-examination of different parties, to the requirement of certain notices. So there are a whole host of problems that would ensue potentially if you were to deem this to be an adjudicatory proceeding. Furthermore, it's difficult to even pinpoint what you would consider the adjudicatory proceeding to be, whether that would be some particular hearing, or whether it would be the whole process from the moment the application is submitted through the award, or what exactly the proceeding would be. So for those reasons, in conjunction with the fact that the definition of the term adjudicatory proceeding in Chapter 30A says that it's an adjudicatory proceeding essentially if you have either a constitutional right to a hearing or a statutory right to a hearing. And in the context of the award of gaming licenses, there is neither a constitutional right to a hearing nor a statutory right to a hearing. So I would suggest it doesn't even meet the definition of an adjudicatory proceeding. Certainly, if you wanted to consider it that, you could, but I don't think that is, would be helpful to this process. What you have done, of course, is built in a number of protections in other areas. There are multiple opportunities for public comment. There are opportunities for applicants to provide information, and multiple opportunities for the commission to review the application in different ways, to conduct hearings, to solicit input, so, and to issue a determination at the end of the day. So we are not in any way removing rights or closing off the process or anything like that. It's a manner in which the proceeding will be handled that I think will help you reach a decision in a more efficient manner, one that you retain full control and discretion over, that you're able to ensure that everyone has a right to participate in to the extent that you think it appropriate, and ultimately that you're able to reach the best decision, and you're not restricted or in any other way. The two cases that we cite in here, if you get a chance to look at them, and I have a copy if you'd like them, discuss these types of issues. One of them involves a school, the Department of Education awarding a charter school license. It was a similar process to this. The court said that that was not an adjudicatory proceeding, and I think that's the closest case to this. And a lot of the principles are discussed in those two cases I cite in there. So for those reasons, I think this is the wise way to proceed. I think this is a highly defensible should, in the event that someone should seek to challenge it for some reason. And ultimately, that's why we elected not to recommend any adjustments to this section.
Sounds reasonable. I had a question on 1804-1, this issue about the host and, referring parts of the application out for review to host and surrounding communities. How did you come down on that?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, we came down on that it was within your discretion to do it if you wanted to or not. You weren't obligated to do it, but if you thought it was going to provide useful information, you certainly could, and it gave you the ability to do that.
Yeah, I guess there's no harm in having the right, yeah. Fine, okay. I forget which section it's in. There's once, seems to be referred in, also in 1804, the best and final, I guess, is that going to be in this, we talk about in this,
Yeah,
it's
it's
discussed
good.
at length here, isn't it? Okay,
In the
yeah.
event that that's
Right.
something you wanted to pursue.
Right,
Yes.
okay. Yep. Okay, go ahead to where you thought.
Okay. Where were we? One minute. I think one of the areas that we got a number of comments on is on page 16, paragraph 3, where we discuss the ability of the commission to consider the proximity of the Category 2 establishment when making decisions.
What section?
Which section are you?
That is it 119?
11903, section 3,
Yeah.
and it's at the very end of that paragraph.
Yeah.
We did get a fair number of comments about taking into consideration both the proximity of other establishments of the same kind in Category 1s versus Category 2s. So we did add language at the end of this section to say the commission could take that into consideration when they're making their award.
Okay.
Okay. Why don't we jump to page 26, so it's section 122.04. This is the capital investment section. Now, this, I think, is an important section. This is not a section that we're necessarily advocating for. It was a section, though, that was based on a comment, and we thought it would be important for the commission to take a look at language like this and consider its merits. And what it has to do with the allowance of a portion of the cost associated with the purchase or lease of the land that the gaming establishment is located on. And what the recommendation, the commission, of course, has determined in the first instance to exclude the cost of the acquisition of land. What this language does here is it would allow an applicant to petition the commission, so it's not an as-of-right thing, you have to petition the commission, to be allowed to include up to 10% of the cost, I just want to make sure I got that right.
It's a total capital investment.
10% of the total capital investment may be the land acquisition costs. And that would essentially get an applicant over the hump of the minimum capital investment, whether it's the $500 million or the $125 million. And it's intended only for compelling circumstances. If for some reason that the applicant was unable to make the last couple $1 million, that they'd be allowed to include the land acquisition costs. So, you know, as I said, we included it so you could consider whether that is a wise way to go about this process, what impact, if any, it would have on your ultimate evaluation, whether it would advantage one party over another, or in fact, whether it may even out the playing field a bit. So I'm certainly happy to comment on it further, but perhaps I should just turn this over at this point.
I have a couple of thoughts. I guess at least I always thought of it as an either or. You know, either the land is in or it's not, sort of like the statute really outlines. I think the suggestion of a cap is an interesting one because it does, well, cap it. And the other piece is relative to differences between or among our applicants, whether it's somebody purchasing something initially having an advantage over another entity that already owns the land, let's say, that entity could itself enter into a lease agreement with another entity, let's say, and be able to be on par with somebody purchasing.
Enter into a lease with itself,
With another, a special purpose entity, let's
Yeah.
say.
which is
itself,
Which
yes.
is itself, yeah.
So conceivably, this may not necessarily treat some of our applicants differently. I mean, I guess we would just have to sort of think about that piece if that would be.
To me, the guiding concept here, that, and I've been uncomfortable with certain aspects of it, that I've been thinking is, what the Commonwealth is looking for is investment that generates economic development. And buying a piece of land doesn't do that. You know, that's simply exchanging value. There's no net gain except for whoever sold the land. So to exempt the land seems to make sense. It makes sense to exempt the land, as opposed to, we talked about this before, why we're excluding construction outside the site. That one I don't understand. You know, that just doesn't make sense to me. If you have to widen a highway that's outside the site, and it costs you $50 million to do that, that's great economic development money. It's good for the throughput of the road. It's $50 million in construction contracts. So if we were gonna change anything, I would change not counting that which is outside the site as opposed to changing the land.
Well, a minor point of clarification, that one cost is particularly or specifically excluded from the category 2, per the statute. The widening of roads to mitigate traffic is a cost that is
Okay.
not to be included there's other infrastructure costs.
Yeah.
So your point is on point, but I thought we had that
Yeah,
discussion.
no, that's a good
already.
point. What we did.
I don't, oh, I'm sorry.
No.
No, go ahead.
No.
Oh, I don't understand why we're doing number 2, what the utility of adding this thing is. We had this discussion before that regardless of what the outside the property boundary infrastructure cost should be in or out. I thought this was, these costs were no value added to the Commonwealth costs, and they shouldn't be included. That's
Does anybody
sort
just?
of a wedge thing.
Right, does anybody disagree with that? I mean, the staff is saying they want us to think about it again, we're thinking about it. Is it-
Because there were several comments, and this was
Right.
almost a way to split it, because you capped
was,
it.
yeah.
So you couldn't have it all,
Right.
but it was a way of considering all of those comments, correct?
That's right.
Right. Well, I'm initially on the notion of excluding the price of the land, because I mean,
Yeah,
That's what-
and then some.
That's what I'm saying.
I think we all are.
We all are, okay.
So, we got that.
All right.
Okay.
Then
that
this,
will-
so
No longer be green, it'll be,
it'll be non-existent.
Non-existent.
White.
Non-existent.
White.
Vaporized.
yeah.
Why don't we just quickly, if we can go to page 30, it's section 124.04. Paragraph 1, this is a strikeout. In the first sentence, I don't recall why we included that language in the first place, but we said that the host community agreement signed by the governing body. Nowhere else did we mandate who had to sign the host community agreement. It doesn't say that in the statute, and that,
Right.
in fact, could prove problematic for certain communities, so we recommend taking it out and let the host community figure out who has to sign the agreement.
Okay.
Page 32, which is section 124.07. I just wanted to note that we struck out paragraph 4 in its entirety. This was the section where the commission could refuse to accept the certified election results. It was suggested to us that perhaps that was not a wise provision to include, in that presently the general laws include provisions for the challenge of election results, and that the commission may not be well equipped to attempt to evaluate certain compliance, and that to the extent that there is a problem that is open and obvious, if you will, that you ultimately hold the cards, and that you don't have to issue a license to a particular applicant if you're aware of obvious irregularities. Perhaps there isn't clear support in the host community, even though the election was certified in theory, and that was a better way to approach this issue than to attempt to invalidate certified election results.
Makes sense.
Sounds reasonable.
Okay. It's a few minutes up to 3. Can we take a break? I need to do a couple things, and we'll come back in 15 minutes or so. Where were you, Attorney Grossman?
Okay, why don't we can start fresh with surrounding communities.
Yes.
How about that?
125, page
Always.
33.
125. Great.
What page?
Page 33 is where 125 begins.
Okay.
So, I guess the first note I would just make is that there was some confusion, I think, as to, it's actually on page 34, paragraph A, what the relation between paragraph A was with letter C on the preceding page. So that's why we proposed the change to the subject heading. just to make clear that those are instructions basically for paragraph C. That's all. The next issue with these is on page 35. It's paragraphs C and D. People have commented on these a number of times, not just during this process, but throughout the course of our public comment process, dating back to the very beginning. And though I think paragraph C is actually well thought out, and I think certainly well intended, it's caused a lot of concern. And I think ultimately that the commission will be able to reach the same conclusions and make decisions on the designation of surrounding communities without this language in there that's caused a great deal of concern. So for that reason, really alone, I think I would recommend that it be removed.
I
Sim-
agree. I agree.
Similar issue with paragraph D. I think we just clarified paragraph D. So we don't say that we're going to be performing any type of balancing test or that positive impacts may outweigh negative impacts, anything along those lines. All we're saying is that we're giving the commission an additional tool, and that if it's helpful in making a determination, you may consider any positive impact. And that's all we say here.
Agreed.
Okay, Mr. Ziemba asked us to mention is, in terms of section 2 of that same section 125, when we discussed this morning allowing the applicant to fix any cure, basically their application, if it came in and it wasn't all complete, we were gonna give them 7 days to cure those items that were in the beige color. One of the things that we want to consider is that we give the communities 10 days after the application to petition. So if an applicant had to cure and had 7 days to cure, the community would perhaps only have 3 days in which to address the cure that applicant may have made. And so there is some question in this regulation as to whether that 10-day timeframe should be at all extended.
Say that again,
So if an application came in and it was deemed to be incomplete in a material way, when we talked this morning, we said we would give the applicant 7 days to cure that whatever was incomplete. If you look at 125.01, section 2, the community has 10 days after the application is filed to file a petition to be a surrounding community. If what had to be cured was something that had to do with a surrounding community, let's say they didn't provide a study or an impact study, or it was something that a community would respond to, by having that 7-day cure in this 10-day period, in theory, you could be saying that a community really had 3 days to figure that out, that they wouldn't be able to determine how to file a petition because they had to wait for the 7 days to see what the cure was. I don't know how likely that is to be an issue. We may want to wait and see how things progress before we try to change something here. But it is, based on our discussion this morning, it is something that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that people have misunderstood that 10-day window. It's really just an administrative 10 days, because the issues that are between the surrounding community prospect and the bidder will have been teed up by then. They're not gonna have to get the application, read it, study it up, and decide whether they're supposed to be a surrounding community. They'll know for the very large extent. Otherwise, 10 days isn't enough to do much of anything, other than sort of get your paperwork together. So I've never looked at that 10 days as a substantive period of time, which gives the surrounding community prospect, time to study things. And people, they've complained about that 10 days, and we've resisted their complaint for this very reason, that it's not a substantive process period.
We did get comments about that particular issue, so it's just.
About it being too short.
About that 10 days
Yeah,
and people
I know.
not having enough time. So we just wanted to raise that because our discussion this morning was new, and that's
Yeah.
something we're gonna add to the regulations, that we
Right.
didn't think about before.
Well, it's right. I mean, it's a good thought. I'm not persuaded that it really is material. That I think the surrounding communities are misunderstanding.
Yes.
What's going to be going on. They're going to know exactly what their argument is well before the application goes in.
Well, I think at least some of them had a thread of, suppose we get stonewalled by the applicant and we don't know anything until the applicant files. Number one, even if they're stonewalled, in response, I think you're right. Even if they're stonewalled by the applicant, there's plenty of ways to get the information what the proposal is. And secondly, if they're stonewalled by the applicant, I think the application process makes pretty clear that in evaluating who gets the license, we're not gonna be positively impressed by the stonewalling exercise, so.
Right, and we've said that repeatedly to the prospective surrounding communities. There's a
Right,
real,
right.
right, so
So,
that,
just to.
right, you're
to
agreeing in
agree,
effect, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
I think now that we have the new language about the 60 and the 90 days,
Right.
I think what we need to do is watch this process. And if we need to make changes here, we certainly can. We can do it by emergency regulation or, in the Phase 3 regulations, we can amend it. We just need to keep an eye and be
Right.
cognizant of that.
Okay. Next.
I think the next section to discuss is section 129, which is on page 49, relative to the transfer of interests.
So we received a few comments on this section. Our sense of the comments was that the people who provided comments made comments based very much upon the corporate structure that they have. Todd and I have talked about this. I think we could use some more help in crafting this regulation, because I'm not sure it completely gets us where we need to go. The regulation has been looked at by our outside counsel, our gaming consultants have reviewed it, but I think other than setting forth the idea that whatever kind of change in interest there is, the commission has the ability to approve it, I think we could probably fix this and make it clearer. So our recommendation on 129 is that we leave this regulation where it is right now, and then perhaps get some more input from maybe some other kinds of legal minds and amend this later. I think it's important that applicants understand that if there are any transfers of interest, we want to approve it and we need to know. But I think we can probably craft this in a way that perhaps isn't quite as confusing to some of the applicants and covers more of the possible ways that they may be structured.
I'm totally fine with that. There were two issues that came up a while back. One was this issue of a financial institution. Why in effect is transfer to a financial institution exempt from being a transfer? That was one issue that we were gonna try to figure out. And then the other one was this Commonwealth share thing. What about those two issues?
The Commonwealth share issue is in the statute, and so
We were just trying to figure out what it meant.
we put it in the regulation, it is part of the statute, it's not entirely clear what it means, so we could probably do some more work and try to quantify that. In the regulation, what we did was we tried to get to where we thought the legislature was going, which is if there's any increase in value, the legislature expects a share of it. But we probably can do more work around that. The financial interest it is one of those things that I think if we understood more of the ways that could occur, we could then draft a regulation that addressed that a little bit better. So that's why we would like to study it more.
So that's part of what you want to still think about.
Yes.
I just think we shouldn't, the way it reads, it doesn't make sense to me. And it seems to create a major loophole that is unfair, given that everybody else has to go through a certain process. Now, maybe there's some explanation for that, but, so I want to make sure we don't leave this. Somehow we got to figure out, is there some rationale for that, and do we buy it?
Well, I think some of it is, there's a certain expectation that there'll be things like mortgages, and we saw in some of the comments, if I give a mortgage on my property, do I have to advise the commission? I think there is a certain piece of it that tries to address, but I think we just need to understand it and understand a little better how these transactions are structured.
Yeah, because the issue was the mortgage holder taking ownership.
Yes.
That's the issue.
Yeah,
That
they
would be
went
exempt,
bankrupt.
right. It looked like that would be exempt from a transfer, and that doesn't make sense.
And that's not what we're looking at.
Yeah.
I must say that I'm very uncomfortable promulgating 129 in any form. I would much prefer to reserve it and do the study and then promulgate it. I read the comments that were made. I read the matrix assessment. I don't understand a bunch of the comments. I understand what they're saying. I don't understand the problem.
The logic.
And I don't understand, there's a reference in the Wynn comments, I think, to a revision that was proposed, that I don't know where the revision is. I don't think any of us know where the revision is.
No, we don't.
There are some corporate securities issues raised there that I don't understand, quite frankly. And so we've got to promulgate a third set of operating regulations in the near term. And I would much rather just say that 129 is reserved, do the research that we need to do the consulting that we need to do, and then in that section promulgate some regulations. I also think this Commonwealth share thing is a continuing problem, and we do ourselves and our stakeholders a service by coming up with some definition of that. Even if we can't, we've got an obligation, I think, to do that, and we can, but we don't have one
Well,
right now.
it's also, I think the law is a may.
Right.
So we could make the decision not to
Right.
use that right,
Right.
but
Right.
one way or the other, I think your suggestion is a very good one.
So we can do that.
I
It's a
think
good
we should,
idea.
yeah, I think,
Yeah.
I agree
Everybody's
with that.
comfortable with
Th-
it.
There cannot be a transfer until there's an award, so we have plenty of
Right, so
time.
we've got some time.
Yeah, we can reserve the section and
Right,
hold
okay.
it for later.
Great.
I don't think we had any further comments that we wanted to highlight.
All right, do you want to do it on 118 through, let's see,
102 through
102,
107?
wherever it is, yeah, 102 through 117?
Sure.
Yeah, we should mention
Why don't we discuss the 102.07, which is on page, it's on page 5?
Page 4, it starts on 4 and goes
Yeah.
on to 5. The heading's on 4, the body of the regulations on 5.
There was some comment on this section. I think it's important that we try to understand what the intent of it is. The intent of this section was not to curtail the ability of a party who has a legitimate right to appeal an action that the commission has taken. That's not what this is intended for, and I don't believe it's what it says. What it is intended to do, however, is to prevent a party from seeking to challenge or enjoin something the commission does based upon an act, based upon a failure to act in some other instance. For example, I think, if for some reason the commission accepts all the RFA2 applications and decides that it does not want to have the executive director conduct a review for completeness, and instead it just wants to move forward with the process, that under this provision, you couldn't challenge the outcome based upon that failure to act. And that's what this is intended to do, to allow the commission the flexibility to enforce its own process and not be held up by challenges based upon certain discretionary acts that it undertakes. This does not apply to statutory requirements, so you can't just not follow a statutory requirement. And the other thing we did based upon comments is that we limited it to 102 through section 128, which pertains to basically the award of the gaming license and the whole surrounding community process. It does not apply to the regs that we'll promulgate in the future. So that's my understanding of the intent of this provision.
Where did this come from?
There were comments made about it. There were comments in general made about the ability of anyone with appropriate standing to challenge the actions of the commission.
Right.
And what we wanted to point out is we're not trying to prevent people from challenging it, but it would be best to challenge a total outcome as opposed to a particular matter along the way, because there is a great deal of discretion that the commission has to review the applications, to create the process they need to create. So that's what this was designed to address.
There's a lot of litigation that, let's take a situation in which take the example that Todd just mentioned, in which an application is submitted, we don't go through an administrative completeness review, it goes directly to one of the the five teams. The applicant is applicant A, no administrative completeness, it's sent down through. Applicant B, who turns out to be unsuccessful, challenges the ultimate award to A on the ground that we didn't conduct an administrative completeness review of A's application before starting the process. This is designed to say you can't do that. Those kinds of challenges typically get caught up in a fight over something called standing, which turns on whether or not the provision in question, in this case the administrative review provision, is designed to afford a right to somebody who is not affected by the administrative review directly. And that can take endless time to figure out. And it's diversionary and it's collateral litigation, and it delays the process. So this is designed to try to ward that off. We might be able to make this a little bit clearer to get at that issue. But that's the essence of it, and it makes sense to have a provision like this. On the other hand, we're not saying that if we fail to give somebody a statutory hearing that the statute requires, that that person who didn't get the statutory hearing they were entitled to get doesn't have the right to challenge our action.
Right, well, that's clear, and but it does seem to me like what we're saying is, we're gonna set out a set of regs that are gonna inform you how we're gonna operate.
Right.
But we don't have to operate by them, and if we choose not to, you don't have any recourse. Now, that example might be irrelevant, but what if we didn't hold the public hearing, not the statutory public hearing, but the voluntary public hearing?
Yeah.
Somebody might say, that's really substantive. You said you were gonna have a public hearing, we were counting on it, we thought that was one of the ways we were gonna manifest our support or lack thereof, and you sideswiped us.
Right.
And this would be trying to say you can't appeal on that basis.
That's right, that would be.
But don't forget that the regulation for a voluntary presentation is also a May regulation. It's not we have the discretion on that other piece.
Yeah.
We've got
But
Mays
we're-
all over the
but we're
place.
pub-
That's what I
yeah,
mean.
But we're publishing a schedule.
Right.
But I could think of another example, I'm sure. The point is, there are steps that are in our regulations that are meaningful on which people might rely, that could be significant arguably, in them winning or losing. And it just doesn't feel, if there's a narrower way, like you were talking about, Judge, in this case, to get at the standing issue, that might make sense, but I sort of feels uncomfortable. It feels uncomfortable to me to say this kind of a broad brush thing that seems to me it could be prejudicial. And B, I don't know whether we could make this stick or not. I mean, is this just words, or can anybody appeal it whether we say this or not?
No, if we use it to forestall third-party issues, i.e., we haven't deprived a applicant of a right that these regulations give it, and we say that the procedures in here that we've set out are not designed to give anybody else a right. There we have to take a closer look, I think. They can't sue to enjoin or to challenge the outcome. I think we can do that, and I think that'd be upheld. We can't strip people's rights away and then say you have no right to challenge us. The problem really is with trying to figure out where the dividing line is. And these regulations are 68 pages long. well, now, when we get finished, they'll be 140 pages long. In there are plenty of opportunities to find things where we didn't do exactly what we said we were going to do. That's going to happen. So the specter of substantial efforts to stop this process for minor deviations from some regulatory scheme are endless, and I think would be, if used, a substantial impediment to us getting where we wanted to go without any commensurate harm being done to anybody. So it's trying to figure out where that dividing line is, and that's real hard.
Well, I leave it to wiser heads than mine to figure that out. I mean, it does seem to me that if there's a way to redraft it and narrow it or somehow, that it would be more effective and more comfortable.
Feel better,
And
right,
feel better,
right.
yeah.
We can work on that.
Okay. So that may mean don't publish this one as it stands. Does it feel that way, Jim? That we would publish
No.
it like it stands?
I would really like to put that in the category of trying to do something in the next couple of days, recirculating it.
Oh, all right.
If anybody's unhappy, we can have another quick hearing.
Okay.
Because I do think this starts right now. I mean, the
Yes.
thing that this is aimed against starts right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
We can take a look at
Page 8,
page 8.
under confidential information.
This is paragraph G. We made the,
Sorry, which
Page
section?
8,
Subparagraph G on page 8.
we made an adjustment here in an effort to ensure that the language of our regulation is enforceable clearly in accordance with the public records law. And ultimately, of course, we have a definition of what confidential information is, and it's consistent with these two sections that are cited here in paragraph G. And after further consideration of the comments and looking at the statute, it seems as though the black language that was struck may be outside the bounds of what the public records law allows for consideration. So in an effort to ensure that we don't instill any kind of false sense of hope upon anyone who submits records to us, that we will make this consideration. I would recommend that we remove that, and we ensure that we just review record submissions in accordance with the public records law and our definition of confidential information, which is consistent with Chapter 23K.
Fine.
That's fine.
I should just further note that this doesn't affect any review we've been doing so far.
Yeah.
We've been doing all of our review consistent with the public records law and 23K as is.
The next section where we had green changes, it's page 21, and I think we may have covered this already. This is the mandatory disclosure of requests of anything of value. We looked at this when we looked at the blue changes. So in Todd's earlier update, we made some changes to what you see here in this language, and we'll incorporate them as we discuss.
The request shall have been reasonably related to the proposed development of a gaming establishment.
That's the point that we need to fix.
Yeah, we have to fix that. That was,
Oh,
we
that's what
talked
you're
about that in the
saying. That was,
update, yes. So
striking
we're going
reasonably,
to,
right.
we're gonna
Okay.
take out reasonably, and we're gonna tame that a little bit.
But I don't quite understand, even with reasonably out, I'm sorry if we've already discussed this. What I had always had in mind is, this was, among other things, this was kind of giving some cover to the applicants, so they couldn't be held up by every Tom, Dick, and Harry that wanted some benefit, you know, to be good, to, you know, to win favor. And so the request might be, I want new uniforms for my Little League team. Is that related to the gambling?
That's the problem,
Yeah.
Mr.
Okay.
Chairman. That, we want to know that, but it's not on the surface of it related. What we want to exclude is the request by the Las Vegas official for a Little League outfit for
Oh, I see.
the Las Vegas team. So we want to restrict it to Massachusetts requests that could have an impact. So we've got to figure out some other way to
Okay.
describe.
Narrow it.
All right, so you're agreeing with, okay, you got it, all right, fine.
Um,
I mean, I think the real heart of it, is the host community. That's really the issue. You
Right.
could say host or surrounding communities. You know, I think it's, you know, what I at least was thinking about was really the host communities. They're the ones, the bidders are the ones who are really vulnerable to that kind of solicitation in a host community. So that would be one way to go, but.
And then the last changes were in section 114. I think we talked about these, like when we talked about it in the
Which page?
prior draft. 114 on page 24, and this is about community disbursements.
Yeah.
We did go through this, so
We
I
did.
think
Yeah,
we're
right.
we're
I would say
fine.
ad infinitum.
And then 115, we added the emergency regulation on holding an election before suitability. We've already gone through that, so. So those, I think, are,
I would just say, Mr. Chair, if you direct your attention to page 22, we addressed one of the issues you raised earlier. It said, section 112.02, it's the obligation to cooperate. I might be again on the wrong page there. There it is, yeah, page 22,
22.
paragraph 2,
Mhm. Yep.
in the red.
Right. What does that respond to?
The obligation to cooperate and provide information relative to the review of the Phase 2 application.
Yeah,
They have an ongoing obligation.
right. Okay. Let me just run through a few other quick things. There were some comments made about the language of about the status of permitting was inconsistent with where the permitting might actually be. Was there anything? This was in the city of Boston. It will not have completed all municipal permitting. But we don't require that permitting, so it's not a problem, okay?
That's a
No.
condition of license.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. And the claim of the city of Boston that they can't be forced to arbitrate, that's not an issue? Okay.
Well, we've allowed them now with a revision to contract out of that whole arbitration proceeding. If they want to put something in the agreement that sets up a different way of dealing with things, they're free to do it.
Well, I was thinking about the arbitration relatives to surrounding
surrounding
communities,
communities.
to being a surrounding community.
So,
Yeah, right,
Sorry.
yeah, okay.
that's different.
Okay. All right, and you've talked all about well, I'm not gonna hold everybody while I run through all my notes, so I'll look at these again, Todd, and if I have anything else I want to ask about, we can do that.
Okay.
Well, that wasn't bad. Is that it?
That's all we have for the comments.
Wow, okay.
We still have the,
Yeah, we still have the chart. but
42 and 41?
I hope everybody who gave comments will appreciate this 44-page document that had every single comment reviewed and thought about it. We're trying to be participatory, transparent, and fair, and with the help of you folks, you staff, we're doing it. So thank you, that was great work. That was great work.
Statement,
at some point, we do need to discuss the small business impact statement and whether the commission is comfortable approving these regs subject to the adjustments that were discussed.
We ought to take those in separate pieces, so why don't I make a motion now that unless there's more discussion about some aspect of the regs, to approve the regs, sections 102 through 129.
131.
Well, 131, leaving out 129.
Leaving out 129. So I would move that we approve the regulations in the form presented to us from sections of 205, CMR 102 to 131, with the changes we've agreed upon, and reserving the right to the staff to make further editorial revisions that don't substantially change the meaning of the regulation question. End of motion, beginning of discussion, reserving that little right inevitably as the staff goes through the last read before they gonna find typos, things that are a little unclear, but it's clear what the meaning was, little sort of editorial changes like that, they ought to have the right to make without coming back to the commission. And then the changes we've agreed to make, and then the 2 changes that are gonna be circulated to the commission are all encompassed by that motion.
And then, second?
Yep.
And then those will be, these will be sent to, who is it, what's the next step in the process?
They just get sent to the secretary.
That's the secretary on the 23rd?
Before that, we filed an updated small business impact statement, and then we would file a copy of the final version of the regulations. And they'd have to be filed by May 24th, which is next Friday, and they would then become effective on
2 weeks later.
Right.
It
Okay.
runs on 2-week cycles, so if we had to, it's important that we get it done by next Friday.
Right, okay. And the way, if we want to make changes after that, we just have to change our regs, right, and go through the
Just
process.
amend them,
Right,
yes.
right.
Not
okay.
written in stone.
Yeah, well, you guys did a great job. I mean, we made our deadline, which is great.
Yep, I joined that. Congratulations to you, the Anderson and Krieger team, especially everybody who follows us. It's clear that by the comments, they're very thoughtful, usually very well articulated, and in many instances right on point. So I thank everybody.
Yeah, it's a good point. By the way, all in favor?
Aye.
Favor.
Aye. All opposed? All right, we have adopted the
work.
regs as written.
Really.
Right.
Thank you.
The small business.
Did you want to do something, say something about the small business statement, Todd? We have seen a draft small business, no, we had a small business statement that accompanied the first round. And we've got to update the small business impact statement. The essence of this is that there is very little small business impact here, right?
That's right, that was the conclusion that was agreed upon when we first filed these with the secretary. I would
Right.
suggest that there was no additional impact that was created by any adjustments after the public hearing. The law requires we submit an updated small business impact statement that we will prepare. And if the commission's comfortable, I recommend that authority to approve the final draft be delegated to Commissioner McHugh, who we will work with to ensure that it gets filed in a timely fashion. Of course, we'll circulate it to you so you can see it as well.
There aren't significant changes from the prior one that are anticipated, but there may be some minor tweaks.
Somebody want to so move?
Yeah, I move that we follow Council Grossman's recommendation and appoint Commissioner McHugh to make the final, to approve the final draft of that small business
Second?
impact statement.
Second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it unanimously.
Thank you.
All right, now.
You have in
41
front of
simple
you
steps.
Yes, the 41 and the 42 simple steps. I don't think there's any action that you have to take on them. We have it here for you to review, and then obviously, once you've had a chance to go through, we can certainly answer questions. I don't know that everyone's been able to go through it in detail.
Well, we've had this for quite a while, so I think probably, or at least we've had versions of this. I
A
certainly,
couple days we've had.
I think a
Yeah.
couple days.
well, anybody want to start? If you got questions, comments?
Well, I have a general one that I think this is very helpful. It's easy to read and understand the process. It articulates well the steps, so I think it's great work as well.
IEB submits written report, step 10, says July 2013. Is that right?
Yes, that would be for category 2.
Yeah, I thought it was June.
Yeah, category 10.
Yeah, this is the slots.
Yeah.
The first one we're doing is the slots.
Is it June?
Red.
I thought it was June.
Okay, June, all right.
And then it seemed to me that steps 22, 3, 4, and 5 ought to all move up after step 17. There's the administrative completeness and everything is the first thing out of the box and the related issues. So 22, 3, 4, and 5 would go up between 17 and 18 before you get to the surrounding community stuff.
Yes.
And it's sort of it's essentially the very first thing we do is the administrative completeness. So then, here are steps 21, MGC here is informational presentations by applicants, October 16 to 18. Well, this is.
Those are just dates.
These are, yeah.
Yeah, they're not cast in stone.
Right. Well, if we're going to publish this, and we should certainly make sure that we've done the best we can do. I mean, that we should put all over this, Elaine, you're going to be wanting to do something with this. This is best judgment draft type thing, but
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, but the dates are different, so.
we should tie them as best we can to A, whatever else is out there, and B, our best judgment.
Yeah, we need to make sure that they're a week date, and whenever it's a gaming commission decision, has to be a meeting scheduled.
Yeah.
By the way, that reminds me, in all these regs are days, calendar days, or business days?
Over 7 days, it's all calendar days.
It's calendar days.
Under 7, I'm sorry. Under 7, it's a full week. Above 7, it's calendar days.
I think that's right. Basically, it's in the regulations. You've adopted essentially the rules of civil procedure relative to computation of time.
Okay.
So
So which is it? If
it's-
you have 7 days.
It's every day unless it's under 7, in which case you exclude the weekends, and then you exclude any holidays as well, I believe.
So if you say 7 days, it's 7 business days, what we would consider 7
I
business
think
days.
that's right.
And anything above 7
It's
is
a
calendar
calendar day.
days. Okay,
I think that's right.
good. Well done.
I read the regs.
Okay, so the optional, when do we plan, or perhaps it's now, to talk about whether we're gonna do this best and final thing? We've got it in here as an option, there was a lot of comment on it. Seems to me that sometime pretty soon, we need to tell the bidders, whether there's gonna be a best and final situation or not. It's not urgent, but.
Well, I think the process here is well laid out. It's first of all, it's a May, and it could come on the heels of narrowing down the pool from 3 to 2 or 4 to 2. And that process would also entail notifying equally, because that was one particular concern, notifying everybody who is in the running, if you will, about what we're asking them to do.
But there was some comment, and there's some comment, and the reason I agree that we need to do it early is that if we said we were going to do a best and final process among finalists and winnow things down, people might hold back, expecting to have to put in more later. if we decide to, and this is in the regs, provision for it's in the regs that we're gonna promulgate. If we decide to continue to contemplate the possibility of doing this, it seems to me we ought to adopt the position that the applicants ought to assume that we're not gonna do it. And we will give them notice if, after the RFA twos are filed, we are gonna do it. Because otherwise, we do risk people holding back and then being surprised when we don't do it. Or we risk them holding back and not, and having all the bad consequences flow. So it seems to me we either say we're not gonna do it for category 2, say, period, or we say we're gonna continue it as an option, but you ought to assume for planning purposes that we're not gonna use it. Maybe tell you if we change your mind.
Yeah, what I took away from here is that if the field is narrowed before the best and final offer, then everybody has the incentive to put their best, a really good proposal, whatever they consider the best, early on. Otherwise, they risk being narrowed out of the first step, if you will.
We haven't even made that decision.
No, we have not,
No.
but
And
it's.
didn't we envision best and final only if there were two that were really close? I mean, very, very close, and we were looking for some kind of a way to distinguish?
Well,
I don't remember that we really decided one way or the other.
We didn't decide, but I don't.
No. I don't like that mechanism, and I'd rather just have it straight out, give us your best shot and go all out. Obviously, we will be talking to people, and there is room to talk to people, and that's reasonable, and but to have a competitive best and final, it's just a process I don't like. I mean, I think we've talked about, I particularly have talked about not pushing people farther than they should go. And, we want them to put up their best stuff, but we don't want to then turn the screw and get an extra $1 million out of them. And that's sort of what that leads to, that kind of, and they're going to be sitting there, oh my God, we're this far in, we've come all this way. And, I mean, one way it's good, you're pushing them, but I don't know, I don't like that kind of negotiating. I'm not that comfortable with that mechanism. You're a professional at this, so.
well, the best and final works well when there's a clear financial piece. When you're selling a bond.
Yeah, right.
And you can disclose the lowest, and then, maybe the lowest doesn't like it, but, if you
Right.
say that's gonna be the rules in advance, they have to accept it. When you have so many competing interests here, the quality of strategic plan, let's say, it gets very difficult. And perhaps that's really what we're all wrestling with.
Yeah. Well, do we have a consensus that we would take this out, not give ourselves the option, or?
In some senses, category 2 is a stalking horse for category 1. I would like to take it out of category 2, get through category 2
See how it goes.
for the minute, leave it in category 1. It's in the regs, so we wouldn't have to change the regs, and then see whether we wish we'd done it. I suspect we won't, but at least we have the option.
And it's a little bit of we can go talk to people, but it just wouldn't be formally planned for best and final. We can always go and negotiate with bidders and say, I think we want to do the deal with you, but you got to do such and such, or this is inadequate on this particular angle, or whatever. So it doesn't preclude us from negotiating or tweaking at all.
No,
But
no,
it just
no,
takes
I
that structure.
don't think it does.
Yeah, right.
No.
Okay, so.
Having said that, that raised a bunch of hackles last time we said that. I mean, we have to understand, and I think we all do understand, we have to be careful about that. Not to give somebody an inside track, or appear to give them an inside track by saying, we're with you if you just do this, without giving other people. But I think we understand that we've got to continue the transparency
Yeah,
through the
right,
process.
I hear that, I get that,
Right.
good point. Okay, so shall we decide then today that for the purposes of the Region 2, or the Category 2 license, that we will not conduct a best and final, a formal best and final bid process? Whether we winnow down to 2 or not, I don't think we can decide at the time. We don't have to, nobody cares about that.
Well, we have the ability
We can do
by
that.
regulation currently.
Whenever we want, yeah.
Yep.
Right. So those should come out, those 2 should come out. Is it clear, this says that we issue a statement of findings, and that was one of these things in this piles of questions I was gonna get to. Is it clear what we have to articulate in writing about our decisions, both pro and con? This says, issues a statement of findings as to how each applicant proposes to, well, no, this is pre-decision. MGC, this is, I'm sorry, this is a different point. MGC issues a statement of findings on 39 as to how each applicant proposes to advance the objectives outlined in the general law. I don't know why I'm not sure why we would be doing that, or where that comes
It's
from.
required.
That's in the statute.
It's in the statute.
That we have, prior to making the decision, we have to outline, write up how each one of them would,
We
and
have
then
to make
we pick
findings.
from that?
No, I don't think that's true.
I think we have to make the findings. I don't know that you're picking from that, but I think it's part of, I think what they're trying to say is part of the review, those are the findings you need to make to comply with the statute.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm confusing everybody, including myself. 38 is you make the decision. 39 is you issue a statement of findings, and my question is about what? How do we do 39? Whether it's statutory or anything else.
About the person that is elected.
Well, I'm not sure what 39 means, so that's my question.
The statute says, and I'll just quote it because it's very close to this, in determining whether an applicant shall receive a gaming license, the commission shall evaluate and issue a statement of findings of how each applicant proposes to advance the following objectives. Then there are 18 objectives listed.
So this would be before the award.
It seems to me we would accompany the award ultimately with this.
Okay.
We would make an award and we'd say we award the license to X. Here's the rationale, and in the rationale, we would say applicant X proposes to advance item 1 this way, applicant Y, applicant Z propose to advance it this way. And those findings would be drawn out of the subcommittee reports that we would get.
Right.
And we would tailor that discussion to support to show why we were making the decision that we've made. In the shared drive that we have, there are examples of how the Pennsylvania Commission has done something very similar to this. And it basically goes through and recites what's happened in each objective. These are not the kind of findings of fact that you find in a typical adjudicatory proceeding,
okay.
policy decisions and the like.
Right.
That would be the form.
Okay. And then again, we need to just double check those dates. Make sure that they all square. Step 24, standard conditions to be attached to an award of all gaming licenses. Are these statutorily
Yes,
prescribed?
there's section
Those-
21.
Okay, I see, list them here, yeah, okay, right, okay. And then best and final is described on pages 17, that's coming out. Okay. Right. How does it happen that there's 42 simple steps for Category 1 and 41 simple steps for Category 2?
There's no bond in the category 2.
Oh, all right.
So that's what.
I was wondering about.
Todd, you demand.
Mhm.
And it takes 2 steps to do a button.
It's
Right.
one simple step to the
Right.
bottom.
So there's, for category 2, there's now an informational presentation at the beginning and the public hearing, no more, right? Because the second presentation was tied to the best and final, correct?
Not necessarily. I think the
Not
commission
necessarily?
could conduct as many public hearings as it wants, consistent with what Mr. Day discussed.
You're talking about on the chart of?
Yes,
the floor?
on this chart.
I don't think that's right.
I think there's a section for,
There's a section for the informational presentations, item 20, what is item 21?
21, yes.
And then 26 is the open meeting, which is separate from the public hearing to discuss progress issues. And then there's a formal public hearing after that.
Right.
So
But then
there's
there was
3
a s-
opportunities for.
Right, but the 35 presentation of best and final is now deleted.
right, so actually, that, even though it wouldn't be a presentation of the best and final, but that step was just an opportunity for the applicant to come in at the end and make its final pitch. Maybe if you're still interested in that concept, we could change the title from best and final presentation to just final
Just a presentation. Just a
Well,
final
we
presentation.
went, the process that we went through is
Yes.
described there, and this ought to be driving.
We
Now
have
that-
to reconcile this with that. We
Right.
did this before.
Right.
We saw that, so we will look at that and
Okay.
incorporate
It's
that.
this, and the calendar needs to get translated into this.
That's right.
But it's a great document, and
Yeah.
Elaine, it sounds like we're about there. They've got to do some tweaking on this, but you can have it. Okay. Anything else? You got anything else on your?
All I was mentioning to Catherine is along with reconciling the evaluation process we talked about, we also have the master schedule process, which we have to rearrange the dates formally that may be necessary in order to reconcile the dates of the stuff.
And that's at our next meeting, so.
Yes.
We can roll those dates into this too.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay,
We're going to make sure they're all
Right.
consistent.
Yeah.
okay. Okay,
That's all we have.
all right, I think that's everything. Hard to believe. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody requires medical attention?
Not even.
I know.
Maybe